Welcome back to Subversive Preacher. This is a reflection on the gospel reading for Pentecost 9, which is Matthew 13, 31, 33, and then skipping to 44 to 52. For some reason, I didn't make it up. It's a lectionary. Anyway, you are probably tired about hearing me yammer regarding the differences between Jesus' parables and Matthew's delivery of them. And I wouldn't blame you for that, but really, if we keep our eye on those differences, the difference between the original parable and Matthew's delivery of it, then we'll see something akin to Indiana Jones finding the lost ark. We already know that we're surrounded by raiders who would steal those passages and misuse them for their own purposes. So stick with me here because we're getting really, really close. If if I were to ask you what Jesus' primary teaching was, you might give me an answer like love, or love your neighbors yourself, or love God, or turn the other cheek, stuff like that. And those wouldn't be terrible answers, but they would be wrong ones. Jesus' primary teaching is summed up in a phrase: Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. Why else would Jesus keep telling us what the kingdom of heaven is like if it wasn't for us to build it on earth as it is in heaven? In today's reading alone, we are given 5 similes for what the kingdom of heaven is like. It's like a mustard seed that grows big. It's like yeast that leavens. It's like hidden treasure that creates abundance. It's like a merchant who knows what the greatest treasure is. And it's like the net that holds us all. But the most interesting one for our purposes, I think, is the last one, which isn't about the kingdom of heaven at all. It's about the scribes. It's about the scribes for the kingdom of heaven, who are like a painter or a woodworker or a poet who is able to work a treasure to bring from it both the old and the new. So think about or picture a fine tabletop, worked and loved until it's smooth as a baby's bottom. And it's oiled and it's shined until the natural wavy undulating beauty of the wood grains is paired with splendid inlaid stone and resin. The old and the new rising up from the treasure of what was once a aged tree. The scribe trained in the kingdom of heaven is like that kind of woodworker. And from out of a parable or a story or fractious sets of laws, that scribe massages it until up bubbles wisdom both old and new. It's been said over the centuries that Matthew, the author of the Gospel of Matthew, considered himself a scribe, quote, trained in the kingdom of heaven. Each of the gospel writers had some special grain of wisdom they were trying to work to the surface so it would seep through with particular power and beauty. Mark's was reversal wisdom or paradox wisdom aimed at the utterly Gentile audience. Luke's was a kind of a class warfare aimed at the common folk who had memories of the social margins from which they came or could soon return. Matthew's was Jesus as the fulfillment of Scripture aimed at the Jewish or mixed Jewish-Gentile communities around him. The scribes are characters in the background of the gospel stories. And they're important, but rarely do they catch our attention. They're kind of like the background soundtracks that alert us in a movie when romance is about to bloom, or danger is yawning, or a disaster is about to happen. We hear the music and we respond to it, but our focus is really on the visual motions taking place before our eyes. Well, the scribes are kind of like that. For example, do you remember the important role scribes played in Matthew's telling of the miraculous birth of Jesus? You know, the Christmas story. I'm guessing not, unless you were made to memorize Bible stories word for word as a kid. It is after the Magi have left King Herod, and he turns around and he asks the scribes, where's the Messiah supposed to be born? Bethlehem, of course, they tell him. See what I mean? They're background characters. But what's important about scribes is that they are the ones who interpret Scripture. In a culture in which very few people were literate, the ones who could read and write, especially if they had multiple languages, well, they had true power. They had the privilege of revealing what the meaning of Scripture was. So Herod, who felt threatened by the Magi's claim of the King of the Jews about to be born, called the scribes together and he grilled them on the meaning of the Messianic Scripture. Is an alternative king really going to be born? And if so, where? Matthew fancies himself, quote, a scribe trained in the kingdom of heaven. He's able to interpret the meaning of Scripture. He can tell us, he's claiming, when and where Scripture is fulfilled. I want to share with you this little tidbit of information I came across while preparing for today. It was a black hole that I fell into, which happens from time to time. I just started reading about some obscure thing related to Scripture, and before I know it, 2 or 3 hours have passed. So whether it's germane or not, you end up getting a serving of it, whether you like it or not. So scribes wrote or copied sacred Scripture, of course. That was, in fact, their primary job. But there were scribes in every culture and religion. Then they were writing down administrative details and laws, as well as copying sacred texts. It was the printing press, of course, more or less, that put them out of business. Now, the Jewish scribes, I found out, had some special rules that they had to follow while writing down Torah and other sacred books of the Bible. First, only clean animal skins could be used to write on. Secondly, the ink that they used had to come from a batch with a special recipe. And then, every column written, every single column that was written, could have no less than 48 lines and no more than 60. Now, I love this next one because I do it too. The scribe, when copying sacred text, had to say each word out loud as they were writing it. Now, think about this. Think about how many times the word God is written in Scripture. Picture the thousands and thousands of times that word appears. Well, every time that they were going to write that word, they had to wash their pen first, and they had to wash their entire body first, and they had to wash their hands 7 times first. And if 3 consecutive pages contained mistakes, even small ones that could be corrected, then the whole manuscript had to be redone. There were apparently a bunch of other obsessive rules that scribes had to follow when copying sacred text. But my point in telling you all of this is it was a profession. It had rigorous training and both high esteem and considerable social power. Now, I had an unexpected call from a good clergy friend of mine this week. But when I discovered, it was a friend who had just had a fairly significant retirement thing. But as we talked, I discovered that almost immediately following his retirement, he is now spending the summer as a supply priest in a chapel on an island in Lake Michigan. I said, "Hey, you're supposed to be retired." To which she said, "Well, being a priest isn't a job anyway. It's not like we do any work." Which relates to this from the book of Ecclesiasticus about scribes. The book of Ecclesiasticus says, "The wisdom of the scribe depends on the opportunity of leisure, and he who has little business may become wise." And priests don't work anyway. The wisdom of the scribe depends upon the opportunity for leisure, and he who has little business may become wise. So whether the scribe was born to privilege or became privileged as a scribe, in an agrarian economy in which most people did back-breaking work for small pittances, being a scribe looked pretty soft. And Matthew considered himself a scribe trained in the kingdom of heaven. He was taking stories and sayings and quotations of Jesus that he received from whatever his sources and writing them down while at the same time interpreting them. He writes down a parable or a saying, and then he writes down what he thinks it means. And sometimes he ascribes to Jesus his interpretation of what it means. Now, I'm telling you all this in case you thought my previous critiques of Matthew allegorizing Jesus was a rejection of Matthew, but not at all. Matthew is an ally of ours. Rather, it is to say that Matthew's interpretation is just one man's opinion. He may have been a scribe in his day, but in our day, we're all scribes. At least those who can read and write, and who can look up stuff on Google and DuckDuckGo. For all intents and purposes, especially because of a genocidal war that separated Matthew and Jesus, his scribal interpretations are not any closer to the living Jesus than ours might be. Which means that we cannot lean on him or Mark or Luke or John as the final word. We have our own work to do. And that brings us to the lost ark or the Holy Grail, which we can almost reach out and touch. Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that grows big, yeast that leavens, hidden treasure that creates abundance, a merchant who knows what the greatest value is, a net that holds us all. These are all clues to what we should be looking for and what we should be doing to build the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. You're a scribe. Take this text and interpret its meaning. We're standing right in front of the Holy Grail, and all we need to do is figure out these clues about how to build the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. I'm not exaggerating, really, I'm not. This is our sacred wisdom, and figuring it out and doing it, well, that's our job. It's our task, it's our responsibility, one from which none of us really ever get to retire. Peace be with you.